And now we actually start with the second part of the conference. Exposure of data of your life, in fact, to such an extent that your life is unthinkable in any other way than as the data to which it is permanently, through which it is permanently choreographed, captured. So life is more and more only reduced to this notion of data. And well, needless to say, I think that is a problematic part of the kinetics of information. You see here again how this relates to a long-standing tradition of what I would call implicit eugenics. So how we all have to become enhanced beings, perfect bodies, through an unproblematic, seemingly unproblematic imaginary, for example, related to the world of sports. We all have to become beautiful sportsmen, and therefore controlling every gesture we do through different kinds of biometric devices should become our utmost desire, shouldn't it? Of course. This is one of these biometric devices which you can actually connect to your smartphone all the time so as to share your data. This is becoming more and more popular. In Silicon Valley, people wear this seamlessly, and probably soon we will be wearing them here. And you only have to look at the press every day to see how this is becoming popularized, how this is presented as a desirable technology, without the slightest critique of its implications. Of course, all this is analyzed in, again, frameworks which are not usually questioned in terms of, well, it's taken for granted that efficiency should be a parameter through which you have to measure your hours of sleep or the amount of activity according to the very specific way in which a particular biometric device is measuring a particular, or producing rather, a particular notion of data of the body. This is what some people have called dematerialized materialism, which is this production of a biologized perception of the body, which seems to be producing an idea of a material body. Funnily enough, is inseparable from the notion, from the representation of that biological body as data, so as a kind of dematerialized body. So all those two perceptions, paradoxical though it may be, appear together in a long history going back to the 18th century at least, to state racism as described by Foucault. So we will see more and more of this. We are seeing more and more of this, which is the same affective choreography that you get with the pictures, the ubiquitous pictures. This happy image associated to control, happy affect. So, imperialism as a history of perceptual production. What kind of perceptual fascism or totalitarianism are we inhabiting today? I think this is not very often taken into account, and I think it is a crucial aspect, for me perhaps the most crucial aspect, to understand what kind of ecology and politics we are inhabiting nowadays and how we may intervene in it. Because very often politics and critical discourses focus on so-called contents that are happening within a given perception. But what happens with the production of the perception itself? What other kinds of perception could we produce that allow for different kinds of relations? How is that perception generating a priori a kind of relationality and power relation? I think that is a crucial question. So the perceptual ontology of control and the invention of actuality. Now, I don't know if I have time to go into this deep philosophical question, because now I'm trying to bypass or exceed the distinction between actuality and virtuality by questioning actuality, actually. So, actually questioning actuality. I believe that the idea, the perception of things as already formed, obeys to a particular perceptual ontology. So it's this perspectival machine that has separated us from reality, that has fixed our perception, that allows us to understand things around us, the world in which we move, not as an emergent body of relations, which we could perceive, and sometimes maybe we perceive like that, and we could enhance that kind of perception or expand, but to perceive it as a totally formed kind of world, a totally actualized kind of world, I think is unthinkable, and it would not be possible without this particular perceptual history which I described before, which has fixed an observer. So the fixation of the observer and its split from the observed is a very peculiar perceptual engineering in which we are immersed, which allows for something to be understood as an actualized entity that is already formed, fully formed. I like to experience the world more in terms of a becoming, and this is a very long discourse we would have to undertake now to speak about the history of the ontology of being, which at least should be traced back to Plato, and the history of the ontology of becoming, which has been everywhere else, almost, except for in the Platonic, Christian, Cartesian, informational tradition. Although, of course, it has been erased to a large extent, perceptually erased, by this dominance of the Platonic tradition, which imposes on the movements of the world the transcendent truth of fully formed actualities. Now, I like to think of actuality then as a perceptual construct, a perceptual invention, one we could maybe do away with. And start relating to the world more as something that is not fully formed, that has potentials to unfold in yet unthinkable manners. So, I think that no observer, and this is of course not my thinking, this has been said for 100 years by quantum physics and by a large number of cognitive sciences and all sorts of people, from the arts, sciences, humanities and so on. No observer is ever fully external to what she sees. I think this is not only the case for quantum physics, I think this happens in our daily life. As soon as we step away from the perspectival machine, as soon as we stop feeling and experiencing ourselves as abstract minds, with God, external to a physical world, an objective reality, we realize that we are always part of what we see. We are constituting world of relations, so necessarily what we see is constituting us, and we are also constituting the event of which we are part in many levels. Another important point for me is that movement is never totally reducible to planes and lines, and this can be, I think, if not easily, deeply understood through the notion of proprioception, insofar as these internal sensations of movement that we may be aware of or not, are happening across all sensing modalities, so never reducible to vision. And, well, I do believe that points and planes and lines are a priori a visual construct, although other kinds of perceptual modalities might be captured by that paradigm. So proprioception, I think, exceeds that insofar as it is disseminated across all sensing modalities, and it is emerging all the time across those sensing modalities. It is never fully actualized insofar as it is never reducible to one particular sensing modality or even one particular relation among sensing modalities. It is generating sensing modalities, so to speak, all the time. Then another important question is perceptual indeterminacy. Again, I'm proposing something like bringing the quantum paradigm to daily life. So the virtual condition, of virtual in sense of potential, okay, not of digital. This confusion, please forget about it. Well, try to forget it for a few minutes. We don't have time now to criticize that confusion. So I suggest that perception is a priori happening in the sphere of the illegible, the unthinkable, the open-ended, the virtual, the potential, the non-actualized. And I mean by this our daily perceptions. For example, when you are having a conversation, for me, the interesting thing in a conversation is precisely the open-ended potentialities that are emerging in a particular circumstance in which I can never be fully, in which I will never be able to fully capture or even less reproduce what the other person is thinking, since that thinking is an embodied process that relates to a particular embodied history. And I would need to be the same body with the same history in the same place in order to think and reproduce that embodied history and that thinking. Therefore, when I am conversing with someone, it is an absurdity for me to think that I can reproduce what the other. So for me, there's no transmission of a pattern. There is a differential process of affections. I want to be creatively affected by what the other person is saying or gesturing or projecting, and potentially also creatively affect the other person. And I think this is just one of the many layers which points to how the open-ended, illegible, undefined field of potentiality is what, for me, gives creativity and interest to any interaction that we may have. We could expand on this more. Hopefully we will do this in the weekend when we talk about our case studies, because we have a lot dealing with this. So these are a number of keywords for me. Interaction has been proposed by Karen Barad, and is different from interaction. Interaction is usually conceived as the interplay between pre-existing fully formed entities, fully actualized entities that enter a relation. Now, interaction, firstly, doesn't relate to entities, fully formed entities, but to emergent agencies, and it points to the co-constitutive process in which these agencies create an event, an emergent event in which both agencies or all agencies co-emerge in the process, which means there are no fully formed pre-existing entities in any relational process. Well, of course, this then has to be put in context. The problem we face nowadays is that in this perceptual ecology of control, in which everything seems to be totally formed and actualized, we tend to move along fully actualized kinds of trajectories, which then gives us the impression that effectively all entities are already discretized, separated, split, and fully defined. Therefore, no transformative process is ever happening. So maybe we have to start moving in radically or slightly different ways in order to start experiencing a more intraactive rather than interactive process. Transactive, we mentioned it earlier, is how an activity generates its own conditions, which means if an activity is truly transformative, it is generating its own conditions. Now, of course, again, in this fully actualized perceptual ecology in which we are living, this seems not to be the case. It seems that we already have a given cognitive and epistemological framework from which to analyze everything that we have around us, rather than trying to let new epistemologies and ontologies arise with the kinds of processes in which we are immersed, or from which we emerge. Metaformance is this ongoing emergence and transformation of perception, which means it's not that we are looking at something through a given mode of perception, but what is emerging in the process is the perceptual modality itself without ever fully actualizing. Well, of course, I know this all may sound too abstract, probably, but since we have had already a little bit of practice-related lectures today, maybe you can connect some of these to some of the things that have been said today about how these things can happen, and it can happen in infinite potential manners. So, okay, well, I won't go on now with these. Because I think I'm running out of time, aren't I? So my provocative statement is that in any relational context or metabody, most of what's going on is unformed and undefined. I put this figure of 93% because it's just a little homage to this common assumption in nonverbal communication studies that in a conversation, 93% of what's going on is nonverbal. Do you know these figures? They're a little bit established. I wouldn't, of course, believe in them. It's just... but this, funnily enough, relates to many other similar visions in quantum field theory, for example, to the degree of indeterminacy of matter. In current cosmologies, in which more than 90% of the universe is unknown, dark energy, dark matter, to Taoist worldviews. So there's a very interesting bunch of worldviews and theories of all kinds that point to this, roughly, this figure of indeterminacy. I would even take it further. We could analyze it here. What degree of indeterminacy do we have in this interaction? Of course, we are very aligned here, in spite of this interesting space. So the kinetics, let's say a couple of words on this. The directionalities and speeds, accelerations and smoothings of perceptible and imperceptible, legible and illegible movement operating at multiple levels. So I've spoken earlier about the kinetics of the interface of the visual and manual alignment and of all these circular, linear and dualistic alignments. This is, of course, just part of this history. So I distinguish at least two strata of kinetic alignments of information society, although there can be infinite. But I will focus on these two. And of course, it's not me who has invented some of these vocabulary, but one of them based to, let's say, a Foucauldian critique and another to a Deleuzian critique. So disciplinary stratum is the one inherited from so-called disciplinary society. So from industrial choreographies, mechanistic choreographies, from a deterministic worldview, a Cartesian-Newtonian worldview, and its particular enactment especially in the Victorian era, where desires and bodies had to be channeled to the possibilities of capitalization of the industrial machines, which means, of course, the family. The nuclear family was crucial, a machine for reproduction of workers. Therefore, the desires of the workers had to be channeled into the nuclear family, which of course is not the case in contemporary capitalism, where any desire can be capitalized potentially through all these new kinds of technologies of capitalization of the social networks and so on and so forth. But, of course, this has come after the Victorian era, so unlucky what has become globalized as a dominant regime is the Victorian regime, although, of course, emerging minoritarian affects are also captured in minoritarian niches. So it's becoming more and more complex. So the disciplinary stratum operates through repetition, massive contagion, replication, mostly. But then there is the control stratum. To speak now in terms of disciplinary stratum relates to the Foucauldian critique of disciplinary society, and control stratum to the Deleuzian critique of control society. The informational paradigm that happens in a probabilistic worldview. So in the 20th century, complexity theories have problematized the deterministic worldview inherited from Newton and Descartes. New forms of more sophisticated control emerge through statistic, probabilistics, and so on and so forth, where the emergence of information through people like Norbert Wiener and Claude Shannon was crucial in precisely putting the emergence of novelty as a form of capitalization and therefore of control. That was a crucial turning point in power, which was in the middle of the 20th century. So this happens now more through atomized media, visualization, biometric capture, and the mode. If the previous mode was repetition, massive contagion, replication, the new mode, I think, of preemption happens through acceleration of the new. Now, how could acceleration of the new be a form of control? Well, I think our movement, if it is emerging, let's say, in forms that exceed particular networks of capture and control, has unpredictable differentials in its quality, in its rhythmic and dynamic quality. So if one way of control of movement is through replication of patterns of movement. Another way of control of movement is through speeding up and smoothing these differentials of the quality of the rhythm and dynamic of the movement, which I think is one of the things that's going on now with the acceleration of production of the new, of preempted production of the new in information society. So just to give two possible ways of understanding how control is operating there, where apparently it's just our free will that's getting satisfied, isn't it? So again, instrumentalization of old notions inherited from humanism, but now becoming something slightly different. So how is the engineering of potentials going on here? Well, it's very complex, and this is by no means a summary of the whole story, but there are perceptual alignments of movement. There is a reduction of the proprioceptive diffuseness to this centralization in vision, which is still operating after 500 years or more. There's this fixation of the observer at a distance, which fixes boundaries between the things, this actuality of the boundaries, of the entities. There is this functionality of the choreography, so there's this mechanistic machine of functions. The social body, again, is responding to a mechanistic worldview as a functional machine, which makes our movements aligned in causal relations of functionality. And then an interesting issue about the reduction of the openness of pre-movement. Well, pre-movement is, according to a number of experiments like Benjamin Libet's, there's a number of interesting activities happening at a pre-conscious level before we make our movements. Although some people criticize Libet's experiments, and probably they were biased by a whole number of things, but maybe we can learn something from it. Because I do empathize with the idea that the body, pre-consciously or non-consciously, can sense open-ended anticipations, which, for example, go on in dance all the time, go on in music all the time. How is it possible that two musicians playing together conform one single body, musical body, or two dancers moving together? If you would hear what the other is doing when he does it or she does it, of course it would always be late, but there's a dynamic quality that allows a body to co-constitute a body of intensities with other bodies. So there we have to change our traditional analysis of consciousness, of movement. It's happening in a different way there. So how is that openness of pre-movement reduced? Well, of course, in a mechanistic set of movement relations in which machines obey to a kind of deterministic worldview of preempted choreographies, well, there's not much room, as far as I understand, for this improvisatory open-endedness of our improvisatory movements. So we are more and more aligned in predicted and predictable choreographies. So this is just a number of aspects. So how do we try to open up this ecology of control to an ecology of potential, which foregrounds the open-endedness of our movements and perceptions? How do we go from this linear, perspectival, perceptual paradigm of control to a relational, metadimensional, aperspectival perception? Well, again, today we have seen a number of possibilities for doing this already, and many people, many of us here are working on this from very different perspectives. There's not one recipe for doing this. But, well, there are a number of things that one can think about to undo dualistic separations, undo fixity and framing, centralized perspectives, distance, focus, and so on. So, all this long list of parameters of visual centralization and visual domination that have pervaded over centuries and are becoming complicated now, we can with not great difficulty, we can unsettle these and disalign them in different ways. And I usually find that it's very interesting to do it. Well, I won't go now into this. We will talk about it in the workshop in the weekend. But I like the idea of the microdeviations. The Kleinemann is an old philosophical concept from Epicurus, and later on taken over by Lucretius, and more recently by Deleuzians and Deleuze, which speaks about the infinitesimal deviations of atoms from their movement trajectories that accounts for the emergence of novelty in the world. And I think it's a beautiful theory. Of course, we don't have to believe in atoms. I don't believe in atoms, but I do believe in these infinitesimal deviations. But of course, they are not always that infinitesimal. Sometimes they are smaller than infinitesimal, and sometimes they are more than infinitesimal. So when we are aligned in trajectories, even there's always a slight open-endedness. There's never such a system of control that can preempt movement absolutely and forever. But there, the potential microdeviations of movement that allow for novelty to emerge are very minimal, even less than infinitesimal, I would call it. And in other contexts, and I would say even in our daily lives, those microdeviations become greater, become broader. So my whole idea with this and with the project actually is how to broaden those microdeviations further. And I think this allows now for a new kind of politics as well, which is not a kind of fully confrontational politics of opposing ideological blocks one to the other, but how do we open up slightly and subtly trajectories of movement to something that is slightly more open-ended than what we have? Well, I think I will skip this now. And I will skip also my own work for the moment. Maybe some of you saw it yesterday, we can talk about it later, but well, flash waves, of course I saw it for the first time today, so I would like to think about it more subtly, but many things for me were going on there. And in any case, because what I can briefly say about my recent metaformances is that I stopped having an audience some time ago. Not always, because sometimes I still do things with audience, but I started becoming interested in engaging people in one-to-one encounters, because for me it was so hard to overcome the distance of people, because we are all perceptually aligned with this spectacular paradigm of distancing oneself from what you see. So very often, even in an immersive installation, you would get people who come in and grin and distance themselves almost inevitably from what's going on around them. So I was trying to see how to involve people in such an immanent kind of process that they could not possibly be anymore an external observer. And even there, yesterday, people would start sometimes grinning or doing things that would distance them from what's going on. So it's very hard. But I think that Isabel's work does manage to get, at least for me, to get that kind of immanent relation even with an audience sitting and looking at it, which for me is a very difficult challenge, and I'm trying to figure out how that was working. I think there were many levels that you already described, like this indeterminate nature of the emergent metabody in the beginning, which was challenging the legibility of the body, is one layer. The other is this spatial transformation and amplification, not just amplification of the sounds that envelops you in a kinetic way at different levels of kinetics. So I don't know, there are different ways there. And I guess that there are, as I said, infinite ways of trying to generate a relational, multidimensional perceptual paradigm. Well, hopefully in the Metabody project we will try to do something about that as well. Well, I don't have now to explain because most of you know about the project. So, but this architecture that we aim to build, hopefully by the fourth year of the project, should be precisely, hopefully embodying some of these issues, should be a space that emerges from the movement while not being a mere response to the movement. So it should have its own agency to some extent, while we will be questioning all the time what agency is or could be. And hopefully it will be also a kind of metabody that will hover in this edge of the illegible, in this edge of opening up the potentialities of our interactions, of our ecologies. That, for me at least, is what interests me most in the project, which doesn't have to be the same for everybody involved, so don't worry if you don't share precisely the same interests. That would be the field of potential, that heterogeneities in the project can build up something without mimicking each other in our intentions. And I think that's it for now. And now I would like to welcome Stefan Lorenz-Sortner. Well, sorry, I haven't given you a chance to criticize me, so please do.
You have outlined some strategies to move from an ecology of control to an ecology of potential, which says a lot of things that needs to be undone. Say that we achieve this. Is there then a strategy to prevent the inclusion and perversion of this new situation by capitalism and ecology of control again, which is a very dynamic system that always manages to swallow these new subversive movements?
For me, that is their question, for which I have no answer yet. One answer could be no. There's no way to escape from that. Always someone can come but I'm still intrigued whether we can invent something that conjures certain kinds of appropriations. I don't know. I can't think of it now. So anything I can think of now, I can always imagine some way of it becoming appropriated. But who knows? So that's a crucial thing. Maybe we will end up making a company with...
I had a very different reactions to the whole talk, from what are you talking about to wow, you're totally correct, and one of the things that I feel that is kind of involved me in a very, very dystopic proposition, dystopic description of the role of technology. And perhaps technologies of control from not only digital technologies or, from religious control to many different kinds of social control. Okay, so it preoccupies me a little bit, the mashup of discourses a little bit. But I think I also was connecting with your performative stance, so a little I felt that this is part of your performances, and it was kind of thought-provoking for me about what is that option, because at the end we bounced our head against neoliberal capitalism and how the commodification processes from art and a spectacle where we are sitting now. So this is part of the whole system. So it's like, how can then we can renew perhaps a question is motivating. At the same time, Deleuze and Guattari and all that are part of the post-structuralism, French post-structuralism, that part of the same machinery. So it's quite thought-provoking for me, and at the same time, but I was really kind of moved in a kind of way, or I was reacting negatively to how can then we assume a position that see the dystopic aspect and the utopic aspect at the same time, and or have a middle point of this kind of understanding, because, for example, we flew here just because the technologies, right? And at the same time, I don't think that we have to rehash being Luddites, and so I think that there is something to be pushed. It's something that, but I was kind of, where are you going? And for the sake of clarity,
Well, I think, I tend to be more demonizing technology because there's such an atmosphere of unproblematic utopia around that makes me a bit sick, obviously. But, of course, I mean, I'm never speaking about going back to the woods, although I love the woods. That's part of it. We can do that. But this is whole process of technological invention that we are proposing here, obviously, without disregarding some technology. Obviously, we are complicit now at many levels, not just we flew here, we are in hotels, we are immersed in a spectacular now division, you are sitting there listening to a speaker. Of course, we are. But now, precisely what I think we need to try to expand, and which you were saying already, Isabel, now today, in the research methodology, for example, this issue of experimenting with embodiment at all levels. So I think it's a total contradiction to speak about nonlinear dynamics when you are using a totally linear system of thinking to speak about it. So I think that to know nonlinear dynamics, we need to develop other forms of perception, relation, and movement that are nonlinear. And this implies stepping out from our dear tables, desks, laptops, and all these perceptual alignments in which we're thinking linearly. So I think that rationality is a mode of kinetic alignment of perception. Linearity of thinking is a mode of kinetic alignment of perception. So if we want to think differently, we have to be more experimental with our embodiments. We have to really, because I think we're still this phantom that there's on the one hand a theory, which still will be done on paper. No, let's stop doing it. Well, I mean, we can do it. I do it on paper still. But we can start realizing how the thinking on paper is itself a mode of physical thinking, always, a priori. It's a mode of physical thinking. It's a mode of kinetic alignment. And at the same time, to realize that other forms of movement are also a mode of thinking. So reversely contaminate those ideas and be more experimental with that. And then, of course, we can, I think, and I'm proposing to reflect on this in the weekend, to try to introduce as many elements of self-critique as we can. For example, in the project, what kinds of problematic alignments will we be reproducing, or we are reproducing already? As you say, we are traveling with planes, we are using proprietary software sometimes, we are doing all sorts of very bad things. So we have to think about those as well from more traditional kinds of critical perspectives. There are many levels. I think pluralism I think is necessary, not just to think from one perspective of just say, no, of course not, it's not all technology is better, and technology is, as they say, everything. Dressing, they like to be naked.
For me, it's very important, this thing, because I can see how we can do a new ecology of movement and how we can see ourselves in other ways without thinking what is the materiality we are using to see ourselves in other ways, and who is engaged in this usage. You know, if we are using new technology, so to say, digital stuff, we are engaging the whole continent of Africa there. So I am concerned about the traceability of our new ecology of movement. I don't think we can separate. And probably we would need to think in a very complicated technologies, but not engaging new technologies. There might be new arts and new ways of managing things in analogical ways, which are not so expensive.
Yeah, I think, well, just for Eva, I think was mentioning now the coltan wars, the wars in Africa. So every time we use a computer, we are part of the metabody of relations that is producing the coltan wars in Africa, for example. That is a complex stratification of movement that is part of the kinetics of information as well. So, I think it's crucial to remember that, and we should take it as seriously as possible. So that is part of the kinetic analysis, the kinetology that we should engage with. Of course, then we have to see how far we take it. But, no, sorry, just to clarify, on the other hand, maybe I guess we can use many kinds of technologies. What I like to think is that we can be very creative about technological paradigms, which means the mechanistic paradigm and the informational digital paradigm are not the universal technological paradigms. They are peculiar historical technological paradigms, which means they have a particular history. They obey a certain kind of nonlinear history, but they are not the only ones. I suggest that we invent paradigms that go beyond both the mechanistic and the informational digital. Of course, this is a very broad challenge, which doesn't mean that we stop using them immediately. We would not be able to communicate for a while if we would do that. So it's a complex negotiation, but I think we must take it seriously.
Yeah, I just want to say that it's a preoccupation that I have, that mostly with the kind of trying to use kind of neologisms to talk about globalization, for example. And because we know that the phenomena that might be in relationship with Africa is our kind of post-colonial relationships and things that are there, and then we know that it's a process due to globalization. So it's something that I sense that it would be interesting for the sake of communicating clearly. For example, for me, because I get dizzy, with a lot of new neologisms or alignments, and neologisms kind of way to saying things that perhaps I don't know, in a way I understand dynamic processes of globalization thanks to certain theorizations that we already have. So and they're not linear, actually, because actually we have understood certain things about complexity theory is to understand how complex systems operate. And that is a know-how that we as a species already, at least certain kinds of people already have. And we're not talking there in a big generalized way about we as a globalized economy that is linear thinking. It's like we know an understanding that is more layered. We have more layers of understanding of the complexity of the social operations in which we are involved. So I'm just afraid that what I really would like to be careful is to be naming things just for the sake of renaming things, and because we are talking about really complex stuff, really intense, complex phenomena. Well, yeah, but it's my. For example, calling a Metabody in Africa is a metaphor of globalization. So it's like, well.
But it's not the same because
yeah.
Globalization doesn't necessarily lead to an ontology in which you consider yourself interactive part of what's happening there, and this is considered. Yeah, go. Yeah, well, that's a good point. I think we have to move on. Are you ready?